Morning. Good morning. My name is Michael Ibrahim. I'm the program manager within the Cultural Investment Portfolio at the Mass Cultural Council. The CIP's focus is grants and services for nonprofit organizations, and we are excited to deliver the following workshop for you today, The Role of an Effective Board During Times of Stress, Part 2. This workshop is part of our Recover, Rebuild, and Renew efforts to help organizations come back from COVID-19. Over the next 5 months, we're offering 2 free workshops every Tuesday and every Thursday in the areas of financial management, legal issues, human resources, advocacy, management, and board governance, what we're here today. Joining us today are Claire West and Molly Quinlan Hayes from Claire West Consulting. And we actually have 3 very special guests from our community organizations that you may know of or will find out more about today. John Linehan, the president and CEO of Zoo New England. Chris McCarthy, CEO of Provincetown Art Association and Museum, and Mike Macnowski, board treasurer at Tower Hill Botanic Garden. We're going to do introductions in just a moment, so you get to know who these folks are, but just some ground rules as we get going. You have probably already noticed that we've got some captioning happening on the bottom of the screen. We are providing auto-generated captioning for all of our webinars and services at Mass Cultural Council. If you need additional accommodations in the future, like ASL, please let us know when you register and we'll be happy to accommodate that. If this is something that you want to minimize on the Zoom screen, you could also do that as well. We will have times for questions and answers throughout the presentation. So you want to use the Q&A function and direct your question, since we have 5 folks on the call today, to a specific person. That way we can kind of be efficient with that. This session is being recorded and will be available probably this afternoon. And I'll be sending you a link with the recording and the materials that Claire and Molly want to share, so you can share it out to anybody you think would benefit from this. My colleague Kaylin King is here, and she's going to be providing some resources as we go along. We've got some good time today for conversation. This session runs for 90 minutes, including time to talk to our panelists and have a good conversation on board governance. And with that in mind, why don't I introduce first John Linehan, President and CEO of Zoo New England. Oh, John, I think you're on mute.
How many times have we heard that? I'm at Zoo New England, which is the nonprofit that manages the Franklin Park Zoo in Boston and the Stone Zoo in Stoneham. These 2 zoos are actually owned by the state, and I've been here for 40 years and just hitting my anniversary right around today. And we've come a long way, but I've been taking it from being part of a state agency into a nonprofit management system. So more later.
Thank you, John. Next, I'd like to introduce Chris McCarthy.
Thanks, Michael. Hi, I'm Chris McCarthy. I'm the CEO of the Provincetown Art Association and Museum at the very tip of Cape Cod. I've been here, this is my 20th year actually at PAM as well, and excited to give you my perspective in terms of working with a board during a pandemic.
Thank you, Chris. And finally, we have Mike Macnowski. Mike.
Hi, I am the treasurer at Tower Hill Botanic Garden, just outside of Worcester. I'm a financial advisor as my day job, but over the last 9 months or so, it certainly has felt like my day job has been treasurer at Tower Hill. We've had a lot to do. I joined Tower Hill about 4 years ago, just on the investment committee, and then became the assistant treasurer, and then just over the springtime became the treasurer there. So it's a wonderful organization, 170 acres. It's one of the oldest gardens in the country, and really a lot of exciting stuff happening, certainly over the last couple of years as they embrace this Garden for All mission. So happy to talk further about it.
All right, thank you, Mike. And I see folks are saying their names and their organizations in the chat. That's wonderful. So if you want to introduce yourself there, we'd love to see who's in the room today. And with that, I'd love to hand it over to Claire and Molly.
Thanks, Michael. Thanks for having us. Thanks for joining us, everybody. Please feel free to load all of your questions and answers, if you have them, in the Q&A function, because we'd love it to be interactive. My name is Claire West, Principal, Claire West Consulting, and partner with Molly Quinlan Hayes, Claire West Partners. I'm a short, rapidly graying white woman wearing a multicolored knit dress, and I am coming to you today from the ancestral lands of the Tohono O'odham people. Molly.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Molly Quinlan Hayes. I'm a middle-aged brunette with freckles and glasses. My pronouns are she, her, and hers. And I'm really happy to be back here again after last week. And I am speaking to you from the lands of the Eastern Cherokee and the Lower Muskogee Creek people in Georgia.
So we'd like to thank our representatives from the field, our local reps that are here with us today. And they'll be joining our conversation throughout today and telling a story about their effective boards, since we're focusing on effective boards in times of stress today. And they'll also be helping with the Q&A section at the very end of our presentation today and speaking much more about their experiences. We'd like to remind you that Molly and I are also leading a session on board recruitment and retention during times of stress on February 11th. So please feel free to join us at that time too. At this time, Molly, do you want to talk a little bit about homework?
Yes, thank you. This is part 2, and if you joined us last week, and we will build on the concepts there. If this is your first time, that's fine. We hope you'll find today's content interesting and helpful. And as Michael mentioned, the recordings and handouts from previous sessions are all available on the MCC website. We thought it might first be helpful to find out from those of you who are here, if you did or did not participate last week. So if you could just give us some quick info about that.
And folks can just enter that in the chat, yes or no.
And how are we looking in terms of mix?
Pretty good. A lot of folks did some homework.
Great, good, good. What we'd like to do is just take a few minutes to reflect on those of you who might have done one of the optional exercises after last week. So I'm wondering if anyone would like to talk about if they tried the dashboard exercise and if they have any thoughts, reflections on if that was useful, challenging.
Molly, would you like to folks to put this in the chat?
Yes, please put them in the chat.
Great, thank you.
Let's see. And any thoughts from those of you who might have done the scenario planning, which we'll dig into a little bit more deeply today. And any thoughts about emergency succession planning? Is that something that you, if you didn't have that in place, is it something that you explored with your board? Thank you. We're going to go ahead and as Michael mentioned, we'll jump into the agenda and we'll have more input from Chris, John, and Mike as we go through. So if you do have questions for Claire, myself, or any of our guest speakers, please put those into the Q&A, and Michael will be monitoring that as we go along. And I will toss it back to Claire.
Okay, this is what we're going to be covering in today's session. Molly, I think we have a slide on that. We're going to start with supporting the CEO in making difficult decisions, determining mission critical programming at this time, approaches to scenario planning. We're going to take a little bit deeper dive into that. Digging deeper into the numbers, we did a sort of a $30,000 foot view last session. Using tension as a productive tool and embracing the devil's advocate. How to handle the unexpected. and Stories from the Field, which is where we hand things over to our local experts, and Q&A. So we're going to let you know, and then we'll be wrapping up. That, but have a look at that, and then we'll let you know what we covered in part 1, just for your interest. And like we said, this is available to you. We took a look at the criticality of mission and focus, the board's role in supporting the chief executive. Today, we're going to be looking at the board's role in supporting the chief executive during difficult decisions. Methods for transparent communication internally. The information needs of today's board members. The meaning of the current numbers. Stepping up board participation at this challenging time. Scenario planning, strategic planning, contingency planning. What do they mean? Are they all the same thing? Are they different? And enhanced external communication, pretty important at this time. Looking at how stress creates opportunities, and emergency succession basics. I just want to make mention here of the fact that when we took a look at the major concerns of the registrants, they seemed to fall into 4 buckets. One was sort of feeling overwhelmed by the pandemic, understandable. The second was the board and staff's roles and the delineation between the two. Third seemed to be board engagement and lack of, or boards wanting to be more engaged. And finally, recruitment and retention, which we're going to defer until the 11th. So supporting the chief executive in making difficult choices at this time. I'm going to reiterate something that we touched on in session 1. In your scale of the role of the board, where does board support of your chief executive sit? It's always a governance benchmark. Now, particularly at this time, the CEOs, are charged with making one of the most, or some of the most difficult and creative decisions of their professional lives. So can you be fully supportive? So the board really needs to be listening at this time, to be there, to chair, offer suggestions building on chief executive recommendations. You might just ask the chief executive what's the one thing they need most from you. They're having to make tough financial decisions about margins that were narrow enough to start with, programming that can't happen or might go away or might not be impactful in a virtual setting. They might be having to make HR decisions that are theirs to make and practical, but wrenching at the same time. And they're having to look at deaccessioning of programming and artistic and fixed assets. As the CEO's boss, are you as board members at this time practicing the compassion that's required of the best and most practiced boss? In my experience, I've experienced some really outstanding boards in times of stress. And I would really like just at the end of this session to refer to our guests, because both John and Chris talked about in our previous conversations some ways that their boards had really stepped up, and I'm sure Mike has something to contribute too. Here's a couple of examples from my point of view. In 2008, a major new museum opened in the town where I lived, and overnight the staff was ramped up from 5 to 50. And then the next week, the economic downturn happened seemingly also overnight. All the projections for operating a state-of-the-art museum were reversed. The board worked tirelessly to revise the financial projections, but the staff had to be cut by almost 50%. And as hard as it was to do this, the board realized it was the sole decision of the chief executive, and they supported that 100%. And I was reminded in my conversation with some of our guests earlier on of how the board of True Concord Voices and Orchestra here in Tucson, excuse me, stepped up to the plate every day during the 2024 bubble season. They held a bubble season, dropping off meals, groceries, and other needs at the guest homes of the choir members who'd flown into quarantine for the required number of days before performing. And the board really went above and beyond to make sure the singers, some of the best in the nation, were safe and lack for nothing. But in reflection, I've seen all board members I deal with this past year want to do more, not less, during this first year of the pandemic. And I think that, I would love to toss it over to John, Chris, Mike for their thoughts on this issue, if you have anything to offer.
I would happily suggest one. It was a very important decision that our CEO, Grace Elton, with the help of the finance team and with the full support of the board, decided to not do our annual largest moneymaker. It's Lights, which is our winter night lights show. It normally is a tricky endeavor to manage because it usually takes about 6 months worth of prep time, and also a good amount of resources to invest in time and money ahead of time. And she wrestled with this because it is just beloved by all the patrons of the garden. And she had to, during the summer, she had to announce, and remember what it felt like during the summer. It felt like we were beginning to round the corner, pardon the expression, but it felt like we were beginning to see the light at the end of the tunnel. And she, along with the finance team, had the foresight to realize that winter was going to be difficult again, and we couldn't risk the financial damage of having the governor and other restrictive capacity issues prevent us from having that event. So they canceled it. And it wasn't initially a popular decision, but the board fully stood behind it. And ultimately, the messaging came out as really look at how thoughtful and calculating our CEO is with making sure that we don't just leave this big hole and not have something to replace it. Instead, she knew that through the creative departments at Tower Hill, they came up with Autumn Illuminated, which wasn't as grand, but consistent with the theme that you have seen a lot of institutions over the last 6 months. If you're able to pivot and become more nimble, still take risk, but in a smaller, calculated way, it can still be rewarding. We didn't make as much money with Autumn Illuminated as we normally would with Lights, but it certainly added a significant amount of revenue that otherwise would have been about a $700,000 loss. So it was really a very good example of an unpopular decision backed by a lot of research and a lot of foresight.
Well, I think that is powerful in two ways. One is your board quickly tried to find a way to fill the financial gap. John, I wanted to toss it over to you, if I may, for a second, because you had a Lights experience too that demonstrated how strong your board is.
Yeah, it was almost the opposite. In some ways, we had been working on bringing in a Chinese Lantern Festival for about a year, and it was scheduled to come in late in the summer or midsummer, and it got delayed by COVID. And we were grappling with all the same issues that Michael was talking about, that we might not have anybody who wants to even come out, and we might be so regulated that it might as well be closed. And it wasn't a small investment up front. But I felt, and my executive team felt, that this was a really unique opportunity for us to find a silver lining because we are outdoors. And so I had to sort of talk. I had one particular board member who tends to be a little bit more of a risk taker, and we all together had to talk the rest of the board into voting to continue to do it. And frankly, it was the best decision we ever made. This program did have capacity limits in place and all the other things that we do every day with one-way flow and time ticketing and all that. But and we did have to modify the program, but it sold out every day from August 15th to November 15th. We had actually scheduled to end it in October, and we extended it because it was so popular. It was like one of the hottest tickets in town, and many people couldn't get it. it resulted in nearly 200,000 extra people coming to the zoo and seemed to have a very positive impact on our daytime attendance as well. So we actually used our same ground, used it for more hours per day. And I think it was a difficult decision for the board to support me in this case, because they felt like I was taking extra risk, and I knew I was, but I felt it was calculated risk and with a potential for a major payoff, and that's what we saw from it.
Thanks, John. That's terrific. So we're gonna, hopefully that has got you thinking. We're gonna shift to quite a different subject now, which is discussing elements of programming that is still mission critical, because we would all had to have a look at what we intended to do in 2020 and then what we really did. And I am reminded of a colleague of mine who said at the beginning of March that we're all startups now. So there's a couple of slides that we're going to look at to set the stage for just sort of examining where you are and if you're going to have to make some programming choices. We all are familiar with the SWOT model. I like the SOAR model because it sets the stage for where you are in this new reality. So strengths, opportunities, we're familiar with those two. Aspirations and results. And I just think that this has a slightly more positive bent if we use that as sort of a basis for examining. And for those that need the slide described, what we're looking at is the word SOAR, S-O-A-R at the top, and then 4 quadrants: strengths in red on the left, opportunities in blue on the right, aspirations in purple on the left bottom quadrant, and results in green on the right bottom quadrant. And that is a way that you can sort of chunk what your environment is looking like. Now, the next slide is familiar to many of you, I'm sure, if you're using the life cycles model, so I'll describe it too. And the reason that I am showing this is because I think it's still relevant, because you can determine where you are in your life cycle, where each of your programs is in relationship to other functions, and where you are in your life cycle in the age of COVID. So, you know, it's worth looking at again. So what we're seeing is a graph that sort of looks like climbing a hill and then going back down. And it's divided into columns, which are titled idea, startup, growth, maturity, decline, turnaround, terminal, which are sort of typical phases of a life cycle. And below the hill and the column headings are sort of bands, which are titled life cycle stage, programs, management, governance, financial resources, and administrative systems. And when I use this method to help organizations try and figure out where they are in their life cycle, it's pretty obvious where an organization is, but where are all your functions within the organization? And the point is to sort of align, bring most of our functions into more alignment, because as cultural institutions, most of us seem to have the programs over in the growth and maturity stage, but a lot of the other things tend to lag behind, like management, governance, financial resources, and administrative systems. And that may be untrue of your organization, but it's really a good little tool to try and align those things and see what's been under-resourced and what needs to be better resourced, and what needs to be re-resourced in the time of COVID. Thanks, Molly. If we move on to the next slide. This is the matrix map again. I'm sure it's not unfamiliar to some of you. And if I describe it, we have the words at the top: what's core to our mission, keep, change, liberate. And then we again have a quadrant called the matrix map, and there is an x-axis and a y-axis. Over on the left upper quadrant is a heart, a pink heart, and underneath it we look at high mission impact, low profitability. There's a star on the right upper quadrant, and that is titled high mission impact, high profitability. The left lower quadrant is a stop sign, low mission impact, low profitability. And on the right is a money tree, and it says low mission impact, high profitability. And if you are having to take a look at your programs at any time, like during a board retreat or a strategic planning, this is kind of a dispassionate and humane method for prioritization of programs and activities, and potential for keeping some, pausing some, and blessing and releasing some, with the added new opportunities that have arisen during COVID. So there is a second and a third page to this that is not in this slide, but there are attributes where you can find this matrix map. And you just put your programs in one of the four quadrants or more than one, and then you can sort of see where most of the dots are. Okay, so moving on to the next slide. I have some examples here, and we all have been very creative this past year of ways not-for-profits have risen to the challenge of sort of some form of reinvention. And like I say, most of you have, if you've gone cold and put yourselves on ice, that's wise in many ways. If you've tried to reinvent and sort of reprogram, then I just wanted to use this moment as a moment to celebrate that. So as an example, an organization that a major performing arts center in rural Arizona reinvented itself whilst dark for over 9 months. They're still dark. By hosting, for instance, they did many things. They hosted a residency by a major US dance company who quarantined, who bubbled at a dude ranch and produced new work on stage at the empty theater and shot a movie of the new work in the outlying canyons. And now a small downtown jazz club decided that since it couldn't be opened safely to program the Killer series that it had designed for 2021, because they seat about 150 people, they decided they'd throw all their energy into finding a new home. They hadn't had the time or the bandwidth to do this whilst running all the shows. They had needed to find a new home in 3 years. And now they had the time to do it properly. Many performing arts groups took the opportunity to introduce their artists to their fans in novel ways, including online chats, informal performances, and interviews with composers and performers about their lives and their favorite recipes, or following, in a couple of cases, following researchers out in the field, looking for, in the case of a natural history museum that I work with, looking for botanicals and fossils. This is not a botanical or a fossil. So if we advance the slide, you'll eventually see a museum. This is an example of a wonderful chorale that did what I mentioned earlier on. They did their entire choral season outdoors, and they bubbled like the NBA, and safely, to great success and national attention, they produced their series. And I think I'm in there somewhere sitting on one of the socially distant seats. And a major community a major Southwest community center moved many of its classes outdoors and actually increased its attendance over 2019. A theater company found a special grant in order to pay special attention to developing a young adults mini series over the next 3 years. Its loving and beloved audience is aging, and they needed to look at sustainability in this way. They would never have had the time to do it whilst programming the full season. And a museum took the dark time to develop the virtual museum programs that had been in its long-range plan before COVID, and also took the time to deinstall all the high-touch interactive manipulatives and replace them with exciting new exhibits. And at the same time, they did a deep cleaning of much of their collection. So there are some examples of doing work within mission, but it's now time for a little bit of mission creep. For example, if you are the owner of a large piece of real estate that's sitting dark, what are the needs in the community that you can meet? And we acknowledge this takes some serious thought about the implications of non-mission activities, such as granting, taxes, HR, insurance, etc. So any input from the panel, any Q&As?
Hi, this is John. I was just going to say, I had looked at actually doing an entirely new one-year strategic plan. And for some of the reasons, going back to your grid, we were going through our programming. It was so enormously impacted by the constraints of COVID that so many of our programs couldn't be carried out, so many of our revenue generating programs. And so I had weekly meetings with staff. I had all staff submit ideas. And, you know, we ended up, like so many other places, really putting a lot into digital programming. But obviously that's over in that hard area where it's not generating a lot of direct revenue, if any, for most of it. So we have a Zoo to You program, which now we have a sponsor for. So it is actually generating revenue. But we built an audience base, and it was certainly serving our mission. So I'll stop there.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Okay, Molly, I guess we're bouncing it over to you.
Great. Well, thank you. And John, thank you for the great segue to our next section in terms of approaches to scenario planning. So just to set the stage for this, scenario planning is a method of considering possible futures and how your organization might prepare itself for success. And as we heard from Mike and John, how you explore and tolerate risk as well. So I'm certain that you and your organization have been practicing some version of what I'm about to talk about over the last 10 months, but this will just kind of codify some of those approaches for you. I will say in this process that we're talking about now, it is a what if, then what, but it extends beyond finances and it extends beyond best case, worst case into kind of a spectrum of choices that you might be able to make. So in the scenario planning, you really consider these external forces and trends, the effects those are likely to have on your organization. And what the value of this method is that it helps you operate in today's unpredictable and volatile environment and allows you to pre-think ways that you might respond. So scenario planning definitely, as our speakers have pointed out, needs to involve the staff as well as the board and other stakeholders. The Wallace Foundation with AEA Consulting has developed a toolkit for scenario planning in the current environment with COVID-19. And so some of what I'm about to present is drawn from that, and that's a free resource. It's in the resource list that Kaylin has put together for this series of webinars. So this is an example of looking at these external macro forces and trends. The economy, changes in society, technology, but the volatility of politics and public policy, cultural shifts, environmental and climate change impacts. And of course, we're all dealing with the safety of gathering people in public spaces. So you want to look at these global and national forces and trends. You also want to look at your local and state dynamics, which can include, public arts and culture funding, what your community is like in terms of rural, suburban, or urban, demographic trends in your audiences, as well as your obviously board and staff, and then looking at trends in your own arts and culture discipline. And the next step then is to posit potential futures and what your organization's behavior might be. And again, you've likely been doing this work already, but let's just look at a couple of potential scenarios. You might need to weigh whether the pandemic does or does not get under control this year, whether in-person participation then can ramp back up to previous levels or cannot. What's the public sector response to climate change? Will that accelerate? And whether the economy and employment numbers do or do not improve. No news there. But here's some potential ways you might think through some potential organizational responses. For instance, looking at the growing demands in society for anti-racist actions. That can apply to your programming choices. Who gets put on your stage, your walls, your spaces? Who are the participants that you choose to target to engage? Who is on your board and staff? And looking at increased equity in pay and opportunities. Looking at continued social distance gatherings that we need to have. Obviously, we've heard about programming. You can reflect and showcase locals if you cannot bring in touring artists or guests or touring exhibits. Looking at site-specific programming, small gatherings in certain neighborhoods or parts of your community. Maximizing your capacity to reach participants digitally. A lot of organizations are reaching even more audiences now that they're online. We're responding to this growing on-demand mindset on the part of consumers. Whether you go with that or whether you are clearly offering an alternative, it's just something to keep in mind. And as well to be ready for the demand, because when we can gather again, that momentum and that desire is going to be great on the part of our community members. And the time's effect on public health. Some options that your organization could consider would be partnering with mental health providers and doing programming around public health issues and offering your venue as a potential distribution center for information, for vaccines, and using it for other types of public need. Let's see. As you've experienced in recent months, you've obviously had to consider different scenarios. So we encourage you to look broadly, to look at these combinations of forces and ways that they impact your decision making, the ways that they relate to each other, because none of these things are self-standing. And as you play out these potential scenarios, you want to consider your strengths and weaknesses. Claire mentioned SOAR as opposed to SWOT. I really like that model. And as you and your board colleagues and executive staff weigh your options, we really encourage you again to look at these combinations. If this is the way that your leadership is already handling your situation, kudos to you. You know, a lot of organizations are doing strong work. And if not, that's natural. And we hope that these tips are going to help you put some context around your decisions in a productive way. Again, this is a very simplified snapshot. It really doesn't do justice to the complexity and the nature of true scenario planning, which is often multi-year. But I hope it gives you a sense of why it can be so important and valuable in this moment. So before we move on, ask if there are any questions or if our panelists want to talk a little bit about their approaches to scenario planning.
I'll chime in a little bit on that. For those of you who don't know where Provincetown is, it's at the end of the earth, basically, and getting people to come here anyways is a challenge. So geography and seasonality definitely play into our programming no matter what. So the idea of us combining virtual and in-person when we were allowed to open, we were closed from mid-March to mid-July, really forced us to step it up. And what ends up happening is that, you know, we cram everything into 14 weeks during the season as much as we can, even though we do offer year-round programming. But the idea of now our virtual classes, not only, we have students now from all over the world. We have students from Sweden and England and Italy and London, and this would never happen typically for us. We also have a 20,000 square foot building with very small spaces, so our capacity was always an issue to begin with, not to mention parking and trying to rent a space to stay here in the summer. So our classes during COVID actually doubled in registration, even though we were able to offer outdoor programming as well. This idea of really forcing you to reassess a 400 in-person event to let's cordially invite you not to come to an event and almost make the same amount of money. So I think the idea of really thinking about what is key to your constituents, and because our constituents are made up of year-rounders, second and third homeowners, vacationers, tourists, day trippers, they're all over the place anyway. So this was really a way for us to reassess all kinds of scenario planning, not just budgeting, which I think I have 500 different budgets, maybe, you know, one or two of them kind of played out. But the idea that, you know, is in-person fundraising more relevant than picking up the actual telephone and talking to someone that you haven't spoken with in a year, or going for a walk with somebody, or actually bringing 6 people into the gallery as opposed to 100. The intimacy of what our fundraising rolled out to be ended up being really, really crucial for us. And so now I'm rethinking, do I really have to do 100 events a year? Can we, what, in looking at those grids, you know, what really is profitability versus non, you know, mission based? And I think it's made us rethink so much. And I really believe that there were a lot of silver linings out of this, and we're a very social community, but we had to figure out ways to be connected and remain relevant. And those were really the 2 key things that played out in the end of where we see us moving forward.
You know, Chris, that's actually the perfect segue into the next section too, because what you mentioned amongst the many wonderful things that you mentioned there was that you sort of took the numbers, like who's participating and in what way right now, and should we maintain something about that into the future? You know, do I have to do this many? Can I do this? So anyway, again, we're going to whiplash a little bit into something that's quite different than scenario planning, but might inform it, digging deeper into the numbers. And by numbers, what we're going to look at is, what do the numbers tell us financially? What do they tell us programmatically, as Chris just referred to? And then what are some other areas we can look at? For instance, data mining your own information that you're collecting. So what do the numbers tell us financial? And there's a slide here that it's a little bit difficult to see because it's small, but that's not the point, because I don't particularly need you to read the numbers in the columns. What I need you to see is that the way that this wonderful treasurer presented this financial report to us was in a way that drew our eyes to the areas that he wanted us to look at. You know, some of us are better at reading financial reports than others, and we know where to look and what it means. But this guy wanted us to look at these 4 key takeaways: cash drawdown, receivables, endowment, liabilities, and then what it meant: we're currently liquid and solvent. Good news. Some of the numbers aren't such great news. However, we can move to the next slide, and it's just to reiterate this, to underline it. Michael, you might have something to say about this at the end too. Is again, our treasurer wanted us to look at the green arrows. They pointed to key takeaways, and blue arrows, they pointed to key changes. So for those of you that need the slide described, it's a line item financial report, and the green arrows refer to key takeaways that are bulleted on the right. For instance, initial COVID appeal, reaction positive, and blah, blah, blah. And then referred to the next bullet was some grants that came in, some current expenses driven by utilities, and some, then the key takeaway was, despite circumstances, profitable year to date. And the blue arrows refer to key changes that are bulleted on the right, and they describe a drop in earned revenues, a reduction in total operating expenses, and an operating loss doubled, but cash on hand still covered us up to a point. And so there you go. I just always recommend a docent guided tour through your financial reports. Even if you know how to read a financial report, you need to make sure you understand the meaning of what you're reading. And it gives you examples of not just what to look at, where to look, and how are the numbers both a picture of what just took place, where you are now, and where you can predict. Are there some surprises? Do you need to take a look at your projections? What are the trends? Do you need to celebrate? So I don't know if anybody wants to jump in here, Michael, just because you're the treasurer guy, if you have something to say.
Sure. I have to give a tremendous amount of credit to our CFO and our finance team at Tower Hill. They have developed a wonderful cadence in how this information gets relayed to the finance committee, to the executive committee, and then to the board. They use a narrative, basically a 2 to 3 page narrative, but along the line, every single row has a number next to it. So they can reference within the narrative what line they are talking about. So when they say garden shop sales are better than budget, they can say reference line 34. And they also use a color coding system. So next to each line, there's going to be a green if it's ahead of budget or better than budget. If it's red, it's going to be worse than budget, or they will actually flag something if it's a key concern. Like for instance, our private events obviously was just a disaster over the last year. That wasn't a surprise, but it was important to show in the initial days of the pandemic how much we had originally budgeted before we did a reforecasted budget, how much we originally had budgeted, and how much of a hole that was going to represent in the way of our revenue if we didn't come up with other alternative revenue sources. So that narrative combined with the color coding really gets everyone into a very concise and clear interpretation. Everyone's on the same page regardless of their financial acumen.
Thank you, Michael. And I'm reminded of Molly's wonderful dashboards that she presented in the first session. Am I right, Molly? That wasn't the first session, right? And they are a color coding, a sort of a green, amber, red chart. And I just think it's really great for those that, I mean, the whole board needs to understand what's being presented, but it's a way of making it sort of universally understandable.
Well, one last just quick addition is that I've seen with all the emotion that the last year has charged in us that the narratives went from being pretty mechanical to being actually almost storytelling to a degree. So it's also engaging now. You somewhat look forward to the explanation as it comes out. So.
Have they told you that, Michael?
I don't write it, actually. I just look forward to reading it. No, actually, I shouldn't say that. I do proof it and then add a few things if I feel like things need to be added. But no, our CFO does a wonderful job with her team of putting that out. In fact, I looked back at the one that was sent out in March, and it was one of the more somber ones, which captured the moment. But it was one of the more somber ones I've ever seen. And so having that emotion also does a good job of conveying what the message is. Thanks,
Michael. So what do the numbers tell us programmatically? And I think Chris put it quite nicely. An analysis of the programming data from the past year, according to organizations I'm affiliated with, tells us a couple of things. Virtual is here to stay. So consider investing in streaming technology that meets your high standards if you are going or staying virtual. Audiences are absolutely willing to return to a safe setting. I think all three of our guests have illuminated that today. We've determined that about 50% of our general audiences are willing to come back. If that's not enough to make the math work, then that's worth knowing. A safe setting as far as many arts consumers are concerned is demonstrably hygienic, distanced, masked, and ventilated. As far as timed entry, temperature taking, spaced seating, I don't know. It remains to be seen if turning a performing arts center or just a gathering space into the equivalent of a airplane trip post 9/11 will be seen as unpleasant, but still worth doing. We'll see. So just finally, mining the numbers, what do the numbers tell us? Mining your own fundraising data. Since it's likely that earned income has been affected, you'll be ramping up your contributed income efforts. And with a nod to my colleagues at Abeja Solutions Consulting, the following is useful in tracking what the fundraising data tells us. Organizations of all kinds struggle with consistency year over year in their individual giving fundraising because of three key things. They don't track their donor retention rate. They can't identify which donors are ready to become monthly, major, and planned givers. And they don't have the patience for acquisition of new donors. A lot of this is to do with time. Some of it is to do with your software. But as a result, boards tend to set unrealistic and ever-moving financial goals, neglect donors who could give more if asked, and pursue tactics with low ROI. So these are not criticisms, they're observations with data to back them up. If you see yourself here and want some resources to fix things, we have some awesome and actionable links in the resource section. So I'm going to pause or pass it over to Molly, see if there's any Q&A.
There's actually one question. The slide, Molly's slide a couple ago that had the report. I think yeah, that's it right there. You know, to kind of talk about historical or comparison, Mike talked a little bit about how this was what was in March and how you could look at those two. So should this have the previous report as well, so you can kind of look at it and compare?
Well, this is a comparative. But if you're thinking about a compared to even further back in
I think
time,
so. Yes.
and I think that there are a couple of approaches to this, and I will be brief because of time. But I think that our treasurer thought that it was kind of pointless to be referring back to a certain number of months back. We wanted to see some key changes according to, well, it can be according to many, many things. The budget that you had approved several months ago, where you thought you were going to be. I just think that comparing it to some figures that have just radically changed was kind of pointless.
Right.
I hope that helps a little bit.
John?
If I can jump in, we always, on this same report, we have these first two columns like this, basically what we've done, what are against our budget that we had projected, then the difference. So we have a third column, then we have versus last year at the same point in the fiscal year, and then the difference, and then ultimately what we budgeted in each line item. So we're comparing both against budget and against performance last year at this time. And I find it immensely helpful, and so I think that addresses that question in a different way.
Yeah, thanks.
You have to put it on the long paper if you're gonna.
Yeah, you do. Molly.
Great. Thank you. I'm going to spend just a couple of minutes talking about this idea of using tension as a productive tool, also known as embracing the devil's advocate. So I'd like you to think for just a minute about where you think your board falls on the spectrum of their comfort level with tension. Are they really uncomfortable with it? Do they love it and use it? Are they kind of in the middle and neutral? That might help you kind of frame things for this little model that I'm going to share with you. I would say that some boards, many of the boards that I've worked with, tend to be nice and accommodating. And of course, everyone's had to get a lot more rigorous in the last 10 months. So that's changed a bit. But in typical settings, board members want to be polite. They don't want to make waves. They might feel like they don't have all of the information that other board members do. So they kind of go along with decisions. And Claire found this great quote that the absence of conflict is not harmony, that it's apathy. And I'm not encouraging conflict for conflict's sake, but it's really necessary to move to decisions. And if you bring passion to your board service, then there's likely to be some conflict at some points. And I think that it's particularly important, again, in this volatile moment, because we can't just rely on the past. As Claire just said, figures from a year ago don't make any sense right now. So that kind of past history and received wisdom is not really necessarily relevant anymore. And I have just an anecdote from my own professional life when I was with South Arts, a regional arts organization, lots of state arts agency members on our board. And we got a new board member, a shout out to Malcolm White from Mississippi, an incredible mentor of mine. But when he first came on the board, he wasn't from our circle. He wasn't one of us. He asked questions about things that we've been doing for years. And it was a bit frustrating at first, but he quickly, his learning curve was very quick. And we realized how really insightful and important his questions truly were. And he was very comfortable kind of playing that role. But if you don't have someone on your board that is comfortable kind of, poking holes in things and asking really tough questions, you might think about considering actually appointing a different board member at each meeting as a devil's advocate. That's their role, simply to bring up the opposite side, bring up questions that might be uncomfortable, rotate that around, and that way you'll make sure that you always have some questioning of your assumptions. The next, and I wonder if anyone has any comments about how this works on your board or how you've handled it. Do any of our panelists have any comments or thoughts?
I can comment on this a little bit. My board is 25, and they're from all over the place. Most of the connection being they have a home in Provincetown. We usually meet 6 times a year, and we don't usually meet in the winter at all because no one's here, and we don't never had virtual meetings. And it went from sort of winter time is planning time. This is when we're gearing up. We're getting ready for this and that and the other thing. And all of a sudden, when COVID hit, it was like a bombardment of what are we doing? And a lot of them actually were down here on the Cape in their second homes as opposed to being in cities, which makes a lot of sense. So all of a sudden it went from kind of crickets to turn up the volume to 100, and with 25 differing opinions, it was really where do we go? And now I have been the director here for 20 years. They kind of let me do my thing. And all of a sudden it was a completely different dynamic from we can't open again until there's a vaccine to we need to stay open no matter what. So how do you meet in the middle? And that was the biggest challenge for, I think, the board and for me. And when you're on a Zoom call with 25 people, trying to read body language and people aren't really saying things and they're texting you or sending you this, that, and the other thing, how do you make this work? And what eventually ended up happening is the board president contacted every single board member individually to really get the read on how they felt, their comfort levels. And we did a survey as well. Would you, if the museum opened, would you come in? Would you come in with 10 people, 20 people, that kind of thing, to really mine this data on how the board itself was going to be comfortable first, because they're still the ambassadors of this organization. And do we really want them to say, oh no, don't ever step foot in that place because it's not safe, as opposed to, oh, get out of your house and go. So we really had to think strategically about how this was going to work. And when we decided to when we were able to reopen, we did a lot of dry runs, but we did it with the board first to come in and what is your comfort level and how do you feel? And it was really a whole different way to decision make, because I hate to say it, but a lot of them are like, yeah, do whatever you need to do. I think the other fear was that we were going to run out of money, which I'm happy to report we didn't. The other biggest fear was, are they going to have to give more in order for us not to sustain? And again, that luckily didn't have to happen. Some did and some didn't, but that wasn't one of the factors that was going to determine whether or not we were going to stay afloat. So this really, really played into leadership, alignment, and compromise. And I think those were the 3 things that we really had to do. And I would say that our biggest tension was the staff. I have a staff of 8. I have departments of 1. And, I was getting emails almost every day, like, this is what MoMA is doing, and this is what the Met is doing, and this is what SF MoMA is doing. And they just laid off 100 people, and they did this and this and this. But at the same time, it's like, you need to lay off people, but we want you to do more programming. So it was like, if I lay off somebody, who's doing that programming? So it really became the biggest tension, I think, was the staff. And I'm super protective of the staff too. And, we did a million scenarios. If we lay off for 20% or 25%, how does this affect programming? But I'm happy to report we did get PPP loans too, which helped keep the staff in place. But it also, the staff was able to shift quickly. We were able to stay relevant. And that was the other thing. If we close, what happens? Our donors going to give to an organization that's open as opposed to one that's kind of cold. So there were all of these things that we never ever had to think about before, which really forced us to be on the same page and make a lot of compromises. And I think in the end, our decisions were the right ones. We opened safely. We did it smart. Our donors were great. But I think it was really a teaching and learning point for all of us on the board, and people coming forward and being really honest about how they felt without being defensive. And I think that was really hard for me too, because like I said, this is my domain. And all of a sudden after 20 years, you're going to try to tell me what I need to do here. It's like, and in the past, we've done boot camps so that the board actually knows who the staff person is and what they do. And that really helped with understanding how we all feed and help each other, and one department doesn't run without the other department. And I think it really gave the board a better sense of how this engine works and what was going to help us survive and succeed.
Chris, that is wonderful. What a great kind of microcosm of all of the challenges we've all been facing that you all have worked through. Thank you so much for sharing that.
Sure.
And I'll also reference back to in our part one of this, Claire talked about the need for external communication and making sure that that is aligned as well. So you touched on that a bit, but yes, making sure that board and staff are speaking the same lines publicly and ensuring that everyone has the right information before they speak about the organization. So yes, John.
Molly, I think that there are some Q&As. Michael, it looks like there's some questions that are relevant to what Molly was saying. Should we have a look at those?
Sure. If John wants to go first, then we'll go in the Q&A.
Okay, I'll be quick. I will say
Sorry,
that
John.
that's all right. That we have, our board has gone through a metamorphosis where they were once that board that was very congenial and relatively disengaged, and not in a negative sense, but they weren't into the decision making. We ran it the way we saw it, as you were describing, Chris. And we are in a different time now where some of our experience is not as valuable as it was before. But I think I have a board member, one board member in particular, who I believe it's his hobby to play the devil's advocate, but it's good. And it brings in, he's a lawyer, he's good at cross-examination. So it's really good, and it gets the rest of the board engaged and asking really hard questions and getting a deeper understanding than they ever had before when we're just giving them our side. You know, frankly, we as executive directors, et cetera, we want to run the show the way we want to run the show. And that's not how you use the wisdom and knowledge of your board. And so this has been a great exercise and a great, again, opportunity. When you look at this whole pandemic and the opportunities that are hidden within it, the level of engagement of board members and their ability to contribute to the decision-making in a meaningful way is one of the positives that has come out of it.
Thanks, John. Yes, we do have some questions here. I'd love to kind of go off of that a little bit on the devil's advocate. Someone asked, playing the devil's advocate can be good, but what if you have board members who are just plain scared? What do you do?
Yeah, well, and some of you might have thoughts about this, and I think that that is a natural, and I think that's too why directors are finding that the boards are now so much more kind of microing, because when you're scared, you go down to kind of the grass and the weeds, and you want to understand the nuts and bolts because the larger situation is just very intimidating. So, I think information is important, and we'll talk a little bit in a minute about how to handle unexpected situations. But does anyone else have a great answer for how to help those board members that are just frightened and might be paralyzed?
I can quickly talk about that. So I try to, anytime there's any sort of decision or vote that the board has to consider, I try to actually, you don't want to create somebody's thought process for them, but you want to in some way give a catalyst to it. So some of the quieter voices or the more timid voices, they might be concerned, they might be nervous, but they're afraid to ask a question if they don't fully understand what the question is or what the information is that they're analyzing. So I try to, in my reports, explain the things that I'm nervous about or the things that concern me, even though I fully might support a particular motion or a particular action. I will give the other side of the coin and say, but here are the ways in which this might not work as we hope it does. And that typically fosters enough conversation to begin highlighting, all right, well, this is, if it doesn't work out, these are the steps that we're going to take to course correct. This is the line of credit that we have in place. This is the potential lever that we might be forced to pull in the way of layoffs. You at least let them know that this could be a difficult path if it doesn't work out, but we at least have thought about that as well. And then you also have to, as I said, my day job is a financial advisor, and so much of being a financial advisor is the psychology of understanding why people make certain actions or decisions with their money. And you have to be patient enough, maybe not to consume an entire board meeting, but maybe even reach out to those people one-on-one ahead of time that you think might be nervous, and begin to get to the root of what their anxiety is. And I know that's not a direct answer, but it just is, you have to spend the time and identify the people. This is why we have calls at Tower Hill. We actually have a budget call that anyone can dial into 2 days before the board meeting and ask endless questions if they have them, so that by the time we get to that board meeting for the budget, most of the concerns have already been vetted out.
Brilliant. Thank you. Other questions on this subject, Michael?
Yeah, there's just one left on this one, and then we can go on. And this is obviously a big question. It's about board culture and the culture of the board. That we can go on on this. But someone asked, how would you change a board culture that is too polite?
Right. I think that, as we've heard, the times have created an environment where it's difficult to do that anymore. I don't know, Chris, John, do you have examples of, have you been in that place? It sounds like you're well beyond that place now, but.
Well, I can just tell you that when I started here 20 years ago, every board meeting was like a cat fight. And it's almost like you work so hard to get your board meetings to be polite. And then once they are, it's kind of like, wait a minute, you sort of want between a cat fight and polite. You just want people to be honest. But I think it's really about how they feel comfortable with, other board members. Like a lot of my board members have become friends through our board. It's a very social board. We also pair up new board members when they first come on with somebody, and we do a boot camp so they actually understand, the ins and outs and all that stuff, which doesn't necessarily, answer every question, but the more comfortable they feel with each other. And a lot of the board members, they've put in their time, they sit on other boards, they're seasoned board members, but I think you have to meet somewhere between, I'm just going to nod yes to everything, to the cat fight board, because that doesn't help anybody. And you're always going to get, no matter what, the one or two know-it-alls who think they know everything. And then it also goes to your board president, who needs to squash that every once in a while and give other people an opportunity to speak. So I think it really comes down to the relationship with the board president, who's essentially running these meetings. These are the board president's meetings, and really having an agenda that's firm, and reaching out, like Michael said, in advance to people who may have concerns, or giving them the option to reach out to you, because I'm really close with all my board members too. And I feel like, we have a very open door policy in terms of speaking, but you are going to get people that, no matter what, they don't want to do this in a Zoom situation, especially, and reading board, language, body language, even now in a Zoom meeting. I mean, when someone immediately, puts themselves off camera, or they turn beet red, or they look down, I mean, there's all kinds of things to look for. But I think that, it's about providing a space that feels safe and honest for the most part. But I would never go back to the cat fights again. I can tell you that right now.
Yeah, I've been through just about every kind of board you might describe. The boards that did nothing but fight, the boards that were just super friendly and challenged nothing, to where I am now, which is, I believe, really useful. And I think the tone is often set by the chair, as you said, Chris. And, during a board meeting, even on Zoom, my chair and I are often texting back and forth. And he's a very impatient guy. So time to move on. I'm always getting that. I'm thinking to myself, well, you're the chair. But he has me moving it on. But I think that you do have to have honest and open discussion and be clear that you've considered the alternatives, that you just haven't gone in one direction without considering the alternative routes and why you discounted or made the decision you did. But yeah, we changed our whole board meeting process to where now we do a really quite thorough pre-meeting package. And, we ask early in the agenda, are there any questions or comments on the written package you got? And then we specifically reserve that time for discussion and encourage people to speak out. And sometimes it does drag on, and you do have people who sometimes like to hear themselves talk, but I think it leads to a healthier decision-making process and a healthier board meeting where the board members feel engaged and they feel like they're making a difference.
And I will just add, and kind of just looking at some of the questions, I've had very destructive board members before too, who don't know why they're on the board, but a lot of them are on it for personal gain. And I have gone to the lengths of getting other board members to make them get off, and I've had to do that. I mean, I've been involved with boards for 30 years in nonprofits now throughout my entire career, and there is no ideal board. I mean, yes, you want their expertise, and I think what it comes down to is making the board aware of what you need from them. And for me, I would rather have lunch with you and tell you this is what I need from you. I don't want you to feel like just you're going to throw stuff out there because you feel like you're not being an active board member. It's a lot more helpful to understand what I need and what the staff needs, as opposed to really, the other end of the coin. And I think that that's been really helpful for the way that I've worked with boards for so many years, is to right out of the gate, this is what we expect. This is what you can expect from me. And one of the other questions, when they put you down, that's not acceptable. A board member shouldn't be doing that. I know a lot of times they're volunteering and this and that, but this is where you have to step in to help other members of the board help you. And we had a board president removed from this board many years ago because he was a narcissistic nightmare who just wanted that president title, who really, really screwed up this organization. And it was a nightmare. And I got to tell you, I learned a lot from it though. But I think that if you are in a CEO position and you have board members that are not contributing positively to the growth of you, the board, or anything, you need to get rid of them.
Yeah, we will. I'm going to have to move us along just for time, but Chris, to your point, we're doing, as Claire mentioned, recruitment and retention of board members in times of stress on Thursday morning. And Claire has a great section that is about that, setting expectations in the orientation process and clarity. So yes, we should kind of rope you into that, Chris, as well. I'm going to just quickly talk a little bit about how to handle the unexpected and then still leave some open time for our guests. So obviously we've all been just inundated with unexpected things over the last year. So I'm probably not going to tell you anything that's really new, but here are just things that I have harvested from the many groups that I work with in readiness planning. And, the first kind of rule of handling the unexpected, whether that is, the pandemic, losing a key person, the first thing is don't panic. You all have been creative and resilient up till now. You're making the smart move to take advantage of these resources from MCC. So, do all of those things, talk with your colleagues, gather as much as you can. Also, again, I'm a big believer in readiness planning. And in the first session, we talked about how to have an emergency succession plan if you're losing someone in a leadership position. But other considerations to keep in mind are, financial projections. We talked about what those external forces are, the macro forces. Go to trusted resources. Many of you in your, if you don't belong to your national service organization and your discipline, I would recommend that you do. That's how they support the field. But even so, many of them do research, put out reports, are doing webinars that are free beyond their membership. So really, I go to trusted resources and get good information. I think reflecting back on things that John and Michael have said, having good information and good data to make decisions is really critical, and people need to be able to trust that information. And don't act out of fear. We've heard stories here today of using this as an opportunity, and decisions that are made out of fear are really not necessarily the best decisions that you'll make. And as you look forward, focus on the unique value that you offer to your community. Whether we get another wave or we are reopening by the fall or winter, really looking outward and not inward is critical. So here are just some thoughts about being ready. One is to have a process for making decisions before you need to make them. And one good idea is to document how you've made processes over the last year. Mike's story about how the budget narrative has changed over time, I think is a great example of reflecting on how things evolved and how you made decisions and where you might have done that differently. So you kind of have that for the next crisis that comes along. Are there certain thresholds that you need to reach, or that if you drop below them, things will trigger a decision? Maybe if revenue drops below a certain level, you know that you're going to, make this programmatic change, make this personnel change. And by doing that ahead of time, it takes the emotional distress out of some of that for everybody involved. Obviously, having a process in place to quickly revise your financial projections, the 500 budgets that Chris mentioned. It can seem counterintuitive right now, but if you can, start to build a financial cushion if you don't have one already. Even a modest set aside will be helpful to you in the future. We talked about your service organizations. Make sure that you're connected to your local public health department and your other local first responders. Be realistic, avoid magical thinking. We talked about there is some risk if you decide to hibernate a bit, but that might be a choice that you need to make. And lastly, keep in touch with all of your stakeholders, all of your participants. Let them know how you're doing. People want to help. I get appeals and, I respond because we all want to keep these organizations living and growing, and let people know what they can give. It might not be money, it can be time, it can be expertise, it can be in-kind services. So I ran through that really fast so that we have about 8 minutes left for our guest speakers and other questions that people have. So I'm going to pause there.
I'm just going to jump in briefly because I just want to say that, we're coming to the end, and I know that there are some questions that are going to go unanswered. But the very last slide does have contact information for Molly and myself, and we're fine if you want to contact us directly with questions that didn't get answered today. Michael, back to you.
Great, thank you so much. The next question is kind of a procedural logistic question. And this is to our panelists. Who puts together your board agendas? Do you do it, the executive director, or does the board chair do it? And who runs the board meetings?
I put together the agendas, send it to the board president. We have a conversation about, what's pressing, in non-COVID times. Typically it would be, the business as usual portion. A lot of it was sent out in advance so that we could focus on maybe a program that was upcoming or an exhibition or something like that. But now it's really been about scenario planning and finances. And then my board chair she runs the meeting.
I also put together the agenda and sometimes have the opportunity to discuss it with the chair in advance, not always. But sometimes he'll ask me what are the key things here. But it is a complicated agenda quite often with a lot of, especially lately, a lot of discussion items that are important. And so it is important that people go through the packet before the meeting to have the background to be able to intelligently discuss the topics at hand.
I'll just add one. Grace, our CEO, puts together the board packet, but there's a little bit of a choreographing to these meetings these days. You have to check in and see if it's an advancement-focused discussion. Then you want to make sure that your director of advancement is going to have his particular slides that make him feel comfortable or her feel comfortable in how they're going to present. And when I have to do certain budget conversations, I'll interject my slides. But it starts with Grace, and then she gets the support from everyone else and where they're going to fill in the gap.
Great, thank you. I'm kind of directing this to our CEOs and executive directors out there. We have an anonymous question, and it seems that their board members are not treating them particularly well, putting them down a lot, being dismissive. And I've heard, not this situation obviously, but I've heard this happen before in the organization conversations that we've had. Do you have any advice to this leader about how they could react to this relationship, this treatment?
It's hard, and especially if this is a donor who gives a lot of money, that's always an interesting position. But like I said earlier, I've had issues with board members in the past, but I've had to go and have conversations with the board president or with other board members to really talk about the behavior. And in this instance, it would be, assuming it's not the board president, it would be in their best interest to try to mend that or remove the person from the board, because undermining the CEO does nothing to help the situation. And I'm doing this with the assumption that you're a fabulous executive director working your butt off, as we all do. But at the same time, these are your bosses too. That's the other thing. And I have to remind myself of that all the time, because I always think I'm the boss. But it really is about communication and having that relationship with your executive committee or your officers, so that you can tell them, because if you don't say anything, it's going to get worse and worse, to the point where you fear the board meetings. I had years where, you don't sleep the night before because you're so worried about a board meeting. I still don't like them after 30 years, to tell you the truth, but they're much better than they ever were, because it's about clear communication, relationship building, and all that kind of thing. So that would be my 2 cents.
Yeah, I have not experienced that, but I do think it would benefit whoever that ED or executive director is to hopefully they have good relationships with other board members that can speak on their behalf. I think if you might look defensive if that you're just trying to cut off criticism as opposed to being treated unprofessionally and undermining ways. But I think it works better in a peer-to-peer situation than a staff to board member defensive sort of rear guard.
Thank you, John and Chris. Just to backtrack a little bit, we were talking about different forms of programming, virtual, different ways that folks are interacting with their organizations. And we've talked a little bit about how in this time mission should be steady, but the programming that serves that mission is adapting. And I'm sure Kaylin can drop in a session that we're going to be doing very soon about virtual programming. So if you're interested in that, register for it. But for our leaders that are here today, virtual programming is going to be here. It's one of those trends that moved the whole industry forward. There's several things that this moved at lightning speed. And so how can a nonprofit organization handle that with limited capacity and limited financial investments? People are looking into production capabilities. Is there something they can learn from TV producers or video production companies? And how do they balance investing in those things while keeping some of their other traditional programming going along?
Well, I just want to jump in here and say that A, attend the session that Mass Cultural Council was holding, but B, 2 sessions ago, the Arizona Presenters Alliance, which is an awesome alliance, held an entire session devoted to this very subject matter, because so many of these professionals felt that they'd had to learn a whole new skill, and it was kind of cool. And some of them didn't want to, but those that had just gone with it had really invested in the equipment. And so if the person that's asking the question wants to be in touch with me, I'm more than happy to share with them the information that was shared at that session, because it covered both the high investment and the low investment.
And I'll add that we have our local cable company, Provincetown Television. The director is a great collaborator. And again, we reached out to a lot of our other sister nonprofit organizations, the Provincetown Film Society and television, and they helped us with videotaping, how to, set up for this, that, and the other thing. what equipment we've written several grants to get funding to ramp up our digital equipment so that we can do, 3D exhibition, tours. We teach how to teach on Zoom class now because we had a lot of our instructors who were really leery about teaching a Zoom class, but now we teach you how to do that, but somebody taught us how to do it first. So it's really about reaching out to your peers and your other collaborators, and that's what we did to ramp up the way that we now do digital offering. And we still have a ways to go, but at least it was enough for us to be able to shift quickly and get content online. We also have a ton of stuff from the past, like lectures that we videotaped and all kinds of things. So we pulled that stuff out of the vault and put that up online. So there was a digital connectedness to us for maybe a lecture you missed or something like that. But yeah, so I would say to reach out to your peers. That really helped us a lot.
Yeah, and I would say, this is the future, and we've actually invested in the staff to come on and focus on social media and video, and it's not going to go away. So you might as well embrace it because it's an opportunity, and it will pay off. Well, we have great content, obviously, with animals and baby animals and programs. But one of the things we did have to do was there was a big difference between when we were open and when we were closed. We had a lot more resource time to be producing the Zoo to You programming every day, much of it live. But when we reopened and some other programs got going, we had to cut that back. And now I think it's at 2 or 3 times a week. And so, you're balancing and you do want to draw people to your institution still. So it is a balance, but it is an investment that is going to pay off, whether it be equipment or talent or time.
Great. And I think the challenge for some folks is what do you do with that? Now that you've got new folks coming to your organizations in different ways, Chris was talking about international audiences coming. How do they become donors? How do they stay for the long term if they find themselves in Provincetown? How do you get them to the museum and some in-person programming? But I'd also say that folks are ready for this in ways they've never been ready before. I know Kaylin and I have talked to organizations before this and said, I wish I could do board meetings online to get more people to participate. And the reaction was, oh, that, you'd never do that. The folks are not going to do an online meeting. We're here. Zoom is, second nature to us. So the collective consciousness has moved in a direction and it's now what we take advantage of. It is 11:30. I'll just pose one last question just so I can feel like we've answered all the questions that came in and then we'll wrap up. Someone just has a procedure question. If an organization is updating their bylaws, changing it with the amendments and so forth, should the executive director be involved in those conversations, or is that a board only job?
Yes, absolutely. The executive director should be involved with any kind of bylaw amendment, anything, yes.
I agree. 100%.
Rapid fire. I loved it. Perfect. There you go. So I just want to take the moment to thank our consultants, Claire and Molly, and our panelists, John, Mike, and Chris, for providing their expertise to our field. We really appreciate that. As I said in a moment ago, this recording will be available on the Mass Cultural Council's YouTube channel probably later today. So those of you, I've got all of your emails, and so you'll be getting a notice from me with the recording to this. Feel free to share it with your board, your executive director, anybody else that you think could benefit from that. We'll also be sharing with you the Dropbox that Kaylin has put together, which has the presentation and some of the other tools. You can get that as well. I'm sure someone just asked about the guest contact information. Claire and Molly, I believe we've got yours there. And if you want to Google our other 3, I'm sure you can find them on their websites. You can talk to them too. I need to put your emails out for the world to see. But I also encourage you to register for our last session. Claire and Molly mentioned that, recruitment and retainment, which is a counterpoint to this, on Thursday. And that is pretty much our final section on boards. We're going to get into some legal issues for arts administrators, some management, and some leadership items too. They're all free and available to any cultural nonprofit. You don't have to be a grantee of Mass Cultural Council to take advantage of these things. So feel free to share it out. Thank you to our panelists and our guests, and have a great, hopefully snow okay day. We're supposed to get some more today. I know you, Claire and Molly, you won't see hopefully any today, but be safe and we'll see you at the next session. Thank you so much.
Thank you.